Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington. I am very happy and honored to have two guests with me today. We're going to talk about China. What is going on in China? How is the pandemic affecting the economy, global trade, and lots of other things. Of course, we could have spent a week talking about different aspects of China. We only have an hour, but we'll try to cover many aspects. I have with me today Nicholas Hardy, who is from the Peterson Institute as well. He has written many books about China, Chinese economy, and I would say he's one of the leading experts in the US on China and Chinese economy. We also have Jörg Wittke, who is the Vice President of BASF China, but also a long-term president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, a chamber that has more than 1,700 member companies. And he has lived in China for many, many years. So two experts on China. So where is China today? Well, GDP is 2% lower than before COVID. Last quarter, it grew only with 0.5%. We see increased unemployment, especially among the young people. There has been no tourists, basically no business people coming to the country the last 2 years because it closed down when COVID came in March 2020. They have a zero tolerance policy vis-a-vis COVID-19, which has meant full or partial lockdown in 45 cities, covering 40% of China's GDP, affecting 370 million people. This is immense, of course. And this has led to a lot of human suffering, but also a very difficult business environment. Foreign companies have had a challenging time. Some are moving out, others are considering it. It has negative effect on the predictability, on confidence. And the whole world is affected by hundreds of container ships waiting in Shanghai and other ports. There's a disruption of supply chains. So this is something that the whole world is actually affected by. From the elite, it seems to be that the focus is on the Party Congress this fall, where President Xi will be re-elected. And the policy is not likely to change until then. But will it change afterwards? Well, we'll see. These are a few things we will discuss today, and there is a Q&A where you can put questions, and we'll try to answer a few of them by the end of this session. So to give a brief summary, where would you say that China stands today? Why don't you start, Nick?
If you're directing that to me, I think they're in a very, very difficult position. They're facing a very hard choice between accepting lower economic growth or going for higher growth, but maybe more difficulties with COVID. I think they've made a lot of mistakes on their COVID policy, but we have to keep in mind that they have an elderly population that has not been very well vaccinated. And if they were to relax everything, they might have a lot of medical problems overwhelming their relatively rudimentary hospital healthcare system. So I think they're in a very, very tough situation. I think that's the bottom line.
Jörg, how would you describe the situation? Or anything to add?
I'm here in Beijing, and clearly the policy is zero tolerance. There's no doubt about it. China is in a very awkward position because they did a wonderful job for about 2 years. Zero tolerance is basically an attempt in order to buy time to vaccinate its population. And they did quite well for a period of time. They had 30 million vaccination per day at their peak. Their vaccination is not bad if you consider the third shot, but of course the mutation moves on. And so we have a population now, as Nick was alluding to, that is pretty much vaccination naive and has not been vaccinated properly, because now we have BA.5 coming up, and they have no mRNA, they have no modern technology over here. Zero tolerance is also basically a trademark of the president, and so it's a matter of phase of changing that. And he certainly doesn't have that in mind, given the party congress in late October. So in a way, he's stuck, and we have a situation where they test everyone to death. They are testing in the magnitude of every 3 days. Here in Beijing, I have to go and get tested. In some cities, it is daily. And so basically every round in Shanghai costs about, I think, a billion renminbi. So it is really also draining the coffers of local governments. And zero tolerance does unfortunately not lead to more vaccination. As a matter of fact, recently the news came out that they're vaccinating 1.5 million people only. And as Nick was saying, the vulnerable group is 60 and above. They used to vaccinate 1 million people a day. Now it's 100,000. And why do they not vaccinate more? Well, people have a deep distrust against Chinese vaccines. They have been communicating the dangers of COVID. They are not communicating how the world is finding a way how to live with COVID. People are scared to death about COVID over here. We have cases of 1 or 2 cases that could knocks down a city. Lanzhou, a big city in Gansu province, is in lockdown because of 30 people. Unbelievable. In Sweden, I guess you don't even count anymore. So in a way, we are in a situation where China has not vaccinated properly because of political reasons. They don't accept foreign vaccine. And so we are heading into a time where China definitely responsibly cannot open the border. Impossible. It would cause havoc to the system over here. So my guess is China can, at the earliest, open up late 2023.
Yes, I was going to ask, how long can this be going on? Because, of course, you have the health situation with so many people not vaccinated, and those who are vaccinated with the vaccine that might not give them immunity for such a long time. But we have heard a little bit about protests and about people not getting to hospitals and so on. So if this goes on the whole next year, what effects will this have on people's opinion, and what effect on the economy?
Yeah, well, it is nobody knows, frankly speaking. It is something where, of course, as the Chinese say, they can eat a lot of dirt and they can eat bitterness. But at the same time, yes, you're right. There has been protests in Shanghai, but people get along with the situation so far quite well. But there has been a social media shitstorm, really, recently when the party secretary of Beijing was indicating in the speech that this will go on for another 5 years. And people thought that he's kidding, and they took it out of the internet right away after he said it, but it is on video. And so, I mean, I say end of 2023, but if the party secretary of Beijing says, you know, it's going to be the end in about 5 years, just tells you how long China actually sacrifices economic growth on the altar of purity and zero tolerance. It is something which is unimaginable. And I can imagine that Nick can say something about the economic impact that it has. It will have definitely a very, very dampening impact on the economy. And of course, the lack of ability of traveling of foreign dignitaries are coming over here, or business people, is certainly not helping. But actually also worse is the fact that the Chinese dignitaries are not traveling. And that we have a situation where basically they are all in staged online sessions and not talking to real people. And you can imagine what that does to the information level they have.
Wow. Nick, yeah, how would you say, I mean, the party has published a lot of long-term strategies on how China is going to be independent and leading in strategic sectors and increase domestic innovation and so on. But all those papers, for instance, for 2025 will have to be corrected, I presume. How is the economic situation today, and how is the party coping with it?
Well, I think if we take the whole period of COVID from 2020 to the present, China's doing remarkably well. They didn't go downhill in 2020 like most economies did. They grew at 2%, obviously not great. But if you look at the big declines in Western Europe, the UK, the US, they did remarkably well. 2021, they grew at about 8%. This year in the first half, they grew at 2.5%. I think it's very uncertain what will happen in the second half of this year. If we have more lockdowns, very widespread and sustained, they'll be lucky to get 2% growth this year. If the zero COVID strategy has a little more success and lockdowns are more limited, they might grow at 3% or possibly even 4%. But the 5.5% goal that they announced earlier this year was never, ever within reach, if just for the problems in the property sector alone. And now we have piled on top of that a number of other things. So if you take the whole 3-year period, China's economy this year will be almost, if they avoid big lockdowns in the second half, China's economy will be about 15% bigger than it was in 2019. All the other major economies have not recovered and will not recover to the level of 2019 this year, and that includes the UK, Europe, Japan. The US will be up a little bit over 2019. So the rest of the world has lost 3 years or more, and China's moved ahead 15%. So everyone comments, yes, their growth rate is much lower than it used to be, but in relative terms, they've done reasonably well. Obviously, in the second quarter, they had very weak growth, but things were picking up in June. We had a much stronger growth of retail sales, investment, and other indicators. So the second quarter was very weak, but within that, June had a pretty strong recovery. If they can sustain that, then they can get to 3% or maybe a bit more this year. If lockdowns of the Shanghai type spread, and there's some indication that that's happening now in places like Tianjin, and George mentioned Lanzhou out in Gansu province, then they're probably not going to grow at more than 2%. But we need to recognize that most of the rest of the world seems heading into a recession or is having very, very slow growth, particularly in Europe, but also in the US. So everything's relative.
Absolutely. It's always when you talk about China. But would you say that I mean, there is a growing, and Jörg knows more about this. I saw a report you published a couple of weeks ago that foreign companies are leaving, or some are very frustrated because the business climate is, of course, very difficult when you don't know when there's going to be lockdown, and many people are hindered to travel, and there has been very few, if any, businessmen coming to China the last 2 years. Will this not have effects on a longer term, or is the internal market so big so they can,
Well, let me just make a comment on that. I think that we've misunderstood what's happening to foreign direct investment. Yes, foreign businessmen in general, well, there have been exceptions, but it's much more difficult to travel to China now. But foreign direct investment in China has been going up very, very rapidly. It increased by 35% in 2020, hitting 253 billion US dollars. In 2021, it went up by another 32%, hitting 334 billion. And in the first quarter of this year, it's up another 7% at over 100 billion US dollars. So foreign direct investment has continued to flow into China despite all of the uncertainties, the lockdowns, the inability of foreign business people to travel there. And yes, some companies are moving out of China, but foreign companies have been moving out of China for decades as they've moved to Bangladesh, Vietnam, and so forth. The low end, most labor-intensive stuff has been migrating, but lots of new stuff is coming in, which George can tell us more about, particularly in his industry, where there are some major investments underway. So I don't think foreign direct investment, I would say, is one of the bright spots in the COVID period starting in 2020, at least so far. Now, maybe it'll turn around. There's a long lead time on a lot of these investment decisions. So maybe by the third or fourth quarter, we'll see a collapse in foreign investment. But the thing most people have not recognized is that an increasing share of foreign direct investment in China is reinvestment of profits of existing firms, existing foreign affiliates. Many of them, as all the surveys show, are profitable. They're financing expansion by reinvesting their retained earnings. And that is continuing and has been a growing source of the role of foreign companies.
That's very interesting.
Yeah,
what's your view on
totally.
this, Jörg? Do you share
Well,
this?
totally. Yeah, totally. It's the retained earnings actually is the hidden foreign direct investment. Many of us, in particular in the second half of 2020 and during the whole of 2021, have been excessively profitable. My own company actually grew revenues by 42%, and we have been very happy to remit a lot of dividends back home. And that actually continued all the way into the first and second months of this year. And then, of course, in late March, April, we fell off the cliff. And sort of us staggering along and trying to recuperate in many ways. Indeed, we had a good June, but in many ways it looks like it's a bit of a restocking. People are very worried about getting cut off again. You go from just in time to just in case. So June figures might be a little bit distorted. No, so in a way, the figures actually surprise me always. Nick has commented on the official MOFCOM figures, which are staggering. But at the same time, I hardly see any Europeans putting big bucks here. It's frankly 5 or 10 companies. One of them is my own, with a $10 billion project in Guangdong. ExxonMobil has a huge project in Guangdong, and then you have the car industries. All the others basically very small, very cautious. I guess that minimum 50–60% of the money flowing into China's return money going into the investment heavy hitters of Cayman Islands, Samoa, Hong Kong, and other places, and pop up here with a bit of a tax reduction and other benefits. Because among the foreign community, particularly now, there's a bit of a caution. And of course now, everything has changed. As you rightfully pointed, let me do a commercial. We have this thing coming out, and you can see on the cover is a storm, and you can see a black swan, but the good news is we still have a lighthouse there, so it's a bit of hope. You can download the papers from the European Chamber website free of charge. You don't have to be a member. And our 1,000 by now, Cecilia, 1,800 members, that tells you we're growing and difficult environment. Actually, they indicate that they put investment on hold. Because the big CEOs and CFOs can't travel anymore. We grow out of our own operational business. But I would say the real game changer happened in March. And so the survey we did in February was actually extremely positive. And then, of course, Putin invades Ukraine, and we have a Shanghai lockdown. And so we had a quick fix in May, and it was devastating. It was like yin and yang. And so ever since then, actually, chambers come out with surveys since May, and they're all rather on the cautious or even pessimistic side. Swedish chamber, Danes, and even the Finns and so forth. So in a way, the kind of optimism, the kind of unique China development that Nick was outlining in 2020-21 has gone. And now we are limping along, not sure about where this country is heading. Because, I mean, again, lockdown here, lockdown there. The figure that you actually had was 300+ million was a figure a couple of days ago. On the weekend, it was much better, but still 250 million people were in lockdown or semi-lockdown, 250 million. And what it does is basically it kills consumption. Consumption has been very, very bad. And the Chinese economy, to some extent, now relies on exports again. Export figures coming out of China into the rest of the world has been, European Union has been 20–30% up since September year on year until June. And European import data, exports from Europe into China have been 0, -1, -2% since September. I think in June, actually -9%. That shows there's a very weak demand in China. The US, the companies do a bit better simply because we don't have LNG and soya beans in Europe. But as a matter of fact, the consumption in China has come to some sort of standstill, with a notable exception last 2 months on the car industry, where people really buy a lot of cars, which is great. So in a way, we head for the unknown, and that's it. We don't know where the next lockdown will be, where the next kind of city is going to get hit. I was supposed to go to Chengdu on Monday. I just canceled today because Chengdu has 9 cases. That causes me to cancel because 6 areas are high risk. If I go to Chengdu, I cannot come back to Beijing. I have to go into quarantine for a week plus 7 days at home. So in a way, the zero tolerance actually kills primarily the service sector. Manufacturing does okay. The supply chains are back. The harbors are functioning. But again, consumption is down, and we have a lot of unemployment. That, of course, is a major concern for future consumption. Youth unemployment, 16 to 24, is 19%. Average is about, I guess, 8 or 5 something percent. But that's only urban population. Nobody counts the rural population. And yeah, consumption has been lagging, and you can see it. Shops don't open up again anymore. Cash flow, in particular of mom and pop shops, SMEs, are massively undermined. They can last for 3 months and then they're finished. So in a way, we have a new situation where I could not tell my board what kind of economic figure we have at the end of the year, because every week is changing.
And if the lockdown is going to go on for another couple of years, of course, it would be even more uncertainty. So you said that manufacturing is basically working, but there's still, you know, a gap in the supply chains for all those in Europe or in the rest of the world who are importing from China. So this is, of course, something that needs to be handled as well. If people are locked in and if factories need to close down because of new lockdowns and so on, it will have an effect on the economy. Not
as big as April or May. China has been surprisingly resilient. My own company's Shanghai productions, that's about 30 factories, have all gone through the whole period of time at a lesser utilization rate, and we somehow managed to get stuff out. Again, the ports are out there. The European consumers very happy buying Chinese goods. We used to be at 1.3 billion euro of goods traveling to Europe every day. And again, growth is quite strong, whereas European exports to China at your time was around about 600 million when you were commissioner. And now it's possibly a little bit less even per day. So the trade deficit is widening, and just showing how weak the consumption period is, consumption scenery is over here.
I think George is right. The external sector has been pretty resilient. If you look at the first 6 months, China's exports have averaged about 14% compared to the first half of 2021. And this is in a context of a very, very weak global economy. I don't know, the last estimate I saw for the growth of global trade this year from, I think from the WTO, was for 3%. Well, and China's imports were very weak in June, but they're up about 6% in the first half. So despite some disruption associated with the Shanghai lockdown, I don't think China's contributing to problems in global supply chain difficulties, with exports running 14% in the first half. In June, they picked up a bit. They were running at about 18%. So exports picked up a bit in June after some of the restrictions were lifted. So people have been saying for a couple of years that pretty soon China's, export performance and trade performance is going to come to an end as the rest of the world recovers. But so far, it hasn't happened. We had very strong growth in 2021, about 30%. People don't realize China's trade in 2021 was $6 trillion US, and it grew 30% over what it had been in 2020, despite, or maybe and partially because of pandemics. It's not going to grow at 30% this year, but it's up about it's up about 10% so far this year for total trade in the first half, running at about $3 trillion US. So trade has been a bit of a bright spot. And of course, it's connected to what George said, that is the manufacturing sector compared to the rest of the economy is doing reasonably well. And most of what China exports is manufactured goods.
And these are very interesting figures that you mentioned there. And how should we in the West position ourselves vis-a-vis this? The US still has those tariffs there that President Trump put on China, and I've seen that there's going on a debate for weeks and months on whether to get rid of them or not in the new administration. There's also an encouragement from the government for companies to reshore towards the West. There are the new labor laws, the Forced Labor Act for goods coming from the Xinjiang province, where the atrocities against the Uyghur minority are taking place. And and there are concerns about the security laws in China, in Hong Kong, of course, threats towards Taiwan, the worsening situation of human rights. How should the US position itself vis-a-vis China, knowing that the economy is in a much better state than it is pictured sometimes in Western press, at least, the Chinese economy? I mean.
Well, I think you've pointed out something very important, and that is, I think, I can only speak for Washington, not other capitals, but I think in official circles, there's a tendency to think that the Chinese economy is really doing quite poorly. Mm-hmm. President Biden was bragging a week or so ago that this would be the first year in which the United States grew more rapidly than China. I think that's not likely to happen. I think China has a good chance of growing at 3%, maybe a bit more. The US is going to be lucky to hit 2%. So what's happened during the pandemic is China has converged strongly towards the levels of income of advanced industrial economies. The convergence process has actually been quite robust. And I think the impression in official circles in Washington is that the Chinese economy is very weak, that they've made a lot of mistakes. For example, there's been a lot of discussion about the crackdown on the platform companies that occurred several months ago. But again, I think that's a misunderstanding. If you look at the largest 5, and they're all private companies, so everyone was characterizing this as a big crackdown on the private sector. If you look at the 500 largest private companies in China, only 8 of them are platform companies. The ones we read about all the time, but they're not that big in terms of their contribution to, in terms of their employment. And their contribution to GDP is mostly indirect. They provide services to other companies, like selling things on platforms. So I don't think the crackdown on those companies, may have reduced the wealth of some of the entrepreneurs that founded the companies, but has not really been a big dent in China's economic growth. So I think we've tended to overestimate the problems and underappreciated the extent to which they have done relatively well compared to most advanced industrial economies.
So what should the strategy be if you were to recommend the White House?
Well, I think, if you think they're very weak and on the ropes, then your view is, well, maybe if we tighten up sanctions a little bit more, we can really slow them down and prevent them from achieving some of their long-term objectives. I think that's a mistake. I think, for example, the restrictions on the sale of semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment is likely to cause more harm to the companies engaged in that business, many of which depend very heavily on sales to China. Their profits will go down, their reinvestment will go down. And we'll have to have more things like the CHIP Act with $52 billion to promote the production of semiconductors in the US, because the retained earnings of the companies in the industry in the United States will be adversely affected. People think $52 billion is a lot, but it's over 5 years, so it's $10 billion a year. That's not very much money when you're talking about the semiconductor industry. So I don't think, even if it's finally passed this week in the Senate, I don't think it's going to be a silver bullet for allowing the United States to regain the share of global semiconductor manufacturing that we had a decade or two ago. So I think there's a lot of unrealistic thinking in Washington.
And how about Europe? Yesterday there was a high-level economic trade dialogue between the EU and China. It was virtual, so they didn't meet. But there has been a tougher attitude from Europe's side vis-a-vis China than before. I think I see a more unified view. The investment agreement, of course, is frozen for a long time, and there are lots of trade measures that has been implemented in the European Union, not directly intending vis-a-vis China, but of course it has China all over it. In order to improve the level playing field on screening, on procurement instruments, the due diligence, the anti-coercion, where Lithuania is, of course, a case. So how should the EU engage with China, in your view? I know that you've been very active in the debate here.
Well, I mean, the EU, first of all, should realize how important Chinese products are for the consumers. Again, they have a deflationary impact. It's great products. They sell a lot, but at the same time, it should remind our decision makers that it's a little bit of an unfair game. China has an open house in Europe, whereas we are more or less sort of facing a Chinese buffet, you know, where they just cherry pick what kind of European business they want. Again, the trade figures indicate it. So in a way, the HED yesterday went quite well, surprisingly. We had mixed pickles as usual, nothing on customs, nothing on insurance. The situation on agriculture was slightly better. And on banking, actually, there was a real opening happening as usual. That might have to do with personalities, as we have a very good governor from the central bank, Mr. Yi Gang, over here. So again, it's sort of something where Liu He was masterminding it. And of course, we have a friend and an ally in Liu He. But how much can he push back towards these interest groups that merciless, trying to keep foreigners out of the business over here? Yeah, again, I guess Europe is getting more assertive. I mean, frankly, Cecilia, we were happy that you started that process in order to make it a little bit more realistic of how Europe is dealing with China. And all the toolbox that we have seen by now was initiated during your administration, the screening and so forth. At the same time, we can also see that European business is responding not just to politics, where there's a lot, but also to the circumstances that we face because of COVID. Our survey clearly indicates that we are not leaving China. There's always the question is, are you leaving China? We are not. China is too important for us to sort of turn our back and walk away. But China is not a preferred location for investment anymore in the future, because of all the kind of uncertainty that we are facing. The new development we face over here is in the questionnaire saying, so how are you considering to have future investment elsewhere? And 23, nearly a quarter says yes. And that actually is shifting really into other countries because of COVID, because of the inability of traveling, because of the uncertainty of the economy, the kind of whack-a-mole they have at the COVID policy. Actually, companies are looking at other countries. In a funny twist, China is opening investment opportunities for the likes of Thailand, even India, Malaysia, and Indonesia, not just in Vietnam, and even Korea and Vietnam and Japan actually benefit from this one. We have an exodus of Korean and Japanese companies right now. They're going back to their home markets because they don't see any sense in staying over here. So future business might actually be impacted. And it's very interesting to see Apple, for example, going to India, giving it a try, and then realizing that India is not as bad as they thought. It would be very efficient people in Gujarat, for example. You have all of a sudden new opportunities. So in a way, if China stays with zero tolerance, if China sort of maintains this kind of policy, I don't want to see you over here unless you go through 2 weeks of quarantine, then actually it will be a boost for Southeast Asia and South Asia. And of course, the big picture is carbon neutrality. We all, as multinationals, have pledges for carbon neutrality 2030, 2040, 2050. That means when we put up factories in China, they have to be carbon neutral. Otherwise, we have a huge cost in carbon credits we have to pay in future in order to stay in business. So what we are facing now is the situation that the kind of energy mix is one of the decision-making processes. And in particular, in North China, you are very heavy, still even more so coal-based than it was before. So we have companies in Shenyang, for example, that are very, very successful in the car industry and the supply chain of the car industry. And then are looking into other locations in China because Liaoning or Heilongjiang and Jilin cannot guarantee the amount of renewables that they want to have. My own company negotiated a major contract in Guangdong, and we signed a contract for renewables based on hydro, solar, and nuclear. And so Guangdong all of a sudden is a preferred location. That would, of course, stress the country even more because we have already a natural migration of people and business moving from the north to the south. And now the carbon neutrality targets of companies, even Chinese, is driving this further. Because in Europe, of course, we talk about a carbon border adjustment mechanism, meaning that in the future Chinese companies have to prove what kind of carbon footprint they have, and that might change the game. And then, of course, the ultimate game is back home in headquarters, scenarios are being established that have these funky names like nearshoring and friendshoring. Friendshoring meaning like I look at friendly countries because I get political flack left and right when I dare to put up money in China. And then nearshoring means like, you know, people might in the future ask, oh, what is the carbon footprint of shipping it from here to there, from China back home? And then I find a product made in Turkey may be much better than a product made in China. So in a way, we are in a completely new globalization scheme. We have far more political cards to play. We have far more complex issues to tackle, particularly on carbon neutrality. And so it's globalization is not over, but globalization is going to be very different from now on.
But there's an increased pressure as well from citizens and from companies and from lawmakers and policymakers that companies become more geopolitical in a way. They have to take into account this their carbon footprint, of course, with the new laws coming up in Europe, but also elsewhere there are discussions on carbon pricing, and even China has an emission system as well, and high ambitions. And then you have the whole human rights issue, which is behind the friendshoring concept. That of course there are massive violations of human rights in China, and this is something that companies will have to take into account. And that's why we have this Forced Labor Act that has passed in the US, and there's a Due Diligence Act being discussed in the European Union as well, which is of course country neutral, but a lot of it is directed vis-a-vis China. So this is a new reality that companies will have to face, COVID or not, because this is a feeling of level playing field and pressure from citizens and consumers.
Yeah, I mean, heading a multinational over here, I can tell you, my good old days where I just have to explain market possibilities, market openings, and so it's over. And now it's all about supply chains. Can you audit it? Can you prove it? Can you check it? And you know, we have factories in Xinjiang, and of course, I think we have done a good job in auditing it and doing all the right things. But again, it comes with a negative touch in public perception. And so it's very complicated in order to actually showcase. So I go to the Chinese leadership again and again and say, guys, if you don't let us have certified third-party international accredited auditors going into Xinjiang, then of course we're leaving. I mean, in your country, H&M is the showcase. Helena and H&M, they did the right thing. They left the market because they couldn't prove it. Again, China simply says, you know, believe me, there is nothing. And of course, nobody believes them, as nobody would believe me when I say everything is fine. We need actually paper, we need the accredited, and I invited foreign media to visit our 2 plants in Xinjiang in order to showcase that we can do things differently. It's very complicated. And now, of course, the Ukraine war leads to the association or the assumption that Taiwan is going to be the next Ukraine again and again. I mean, it might not merit much actually credibility. I think that China is not economically suicidal, but fact is we have misjudged Putin. We have definitely put too much faith in his rationality. And now the question is, of course, how is Xi Jinping doing? You know, the recent attempts in order to bully Taiwan, the US reciprocating, making it very, very difficult. Taiwan is really a complicated matter by now. And of course, then the question in headquarters goes like, all right, so let's do scenario planning, and not just plan A and plan B. It goes all the way to, you know, whatever, 3, 4 different scenarios. One of them I discussed this morning with a Chinese think tank of saying, you know, just in case the People's Republic in 5 to 10 years invades Taiwan, then what we're going to do. And I assured them that actually it will happen the same that happened in Russia. Western business has to leave. There's no way in hell they can stay. And so you have to make a scenario that I call 1949. You have to leave the marketplace, you know. Now, again, I think that's very remote and it's not going to happen. Again, the leadership that I meet actually has no attempt whatsoever in order to do this. They all hope that status quo remains. But fact is, in headquarters, all of a sudden you have to deal with questions like this.
Absolutely. Now, Nick, how do you see this? At the last summit of NATO in May, just a couple of weeks ago in Madrid, the NATO communique said that China and Russia are developing a strategic partnership and are at the forefront of an authoritarian pushback against the rule-based international order. And lots of American politicians and Western politicians, European politicians, have been warning China not to support or to bypass the sanction. It seems like China is very supportive in words vis-a-vis Russia, but not much is really happening economy-wise, but it's of course very hard to map. What's your view on that?
Well, my view is people...
I'm not sure you can still hear me, Cecilia.
I can hear you, but I can't see you. I was just waiting for Nick to answer this
I had to
question.
go off. It would be very fitting, a topic like this, and I get cut off.
Yes, let's just answer the question. Nick was just about to answer. We'll come back
Nick,
to you.
go first. Nick, go first. You have a stable line.
Okay. Well, I think politicians have been talking about China's challenge to the Western-based international economic order for 10 or 20 years. But what's the evidence that China has really changed the international economic order? I think we need to kind of dial back the rhetoric and pay more attention to what China's actually doing. And with respect to the Ukraine, yes, they have been very vocal in their support of Russia and justification for the invasion, which I think, of course, is atrocious. But they have not been, they have been basically following the sanctions. They're not violating the sanctions. Yes, they're buying more oil from Russia, apparently, but the sanctions do not yet include a prohibition on buying energy. So they're still having some trade, but I think if you look at the details, as my colleague Martin Schorzempa has done, the sensitive exports to Russia from China have collapsed. And I think the evidence is overwhelming that they're not violating the sanctions. At least, maybe a few firms have figured out some workarounds to violate, but it's not a wholesale policy by any means. So there's a contradiction. They're supporting Russia verbally, but not in terms of actual resources. I think in retrospect, Xi Jinping's decision to align himself so closely with Russia will be seen as a major, major strategic mistake.
I couldn't agree more, Nick, because it's an awkward relationship. Before February 24th, it was an excess of convenience, but now it's an awkward relationship. The only kit that keeps them together is the anti-Americanism that they share. And otherwise, they are sort of subject to all kinds of things. You're totally right. The sanctions are being followed by the Chinese companies, unless you are a smaller company that has no assets in the US or Europe, so you can sin. But even oil, the oil exports from Russia to China have only risen by 1 or 2%. That has to do with the fact that this huge increase in oil that you can see in statistics is just pricing. China now, because of the war, pays $12 billion more for gas and oil, and doesn't buy a single cubic meter or liter more because of that. It is simply the price increase in the commodities that they equally face as we do. The more gas from the power of Siberia of Gazprom is simply a fact that anyhow it was planned because the fields are more developed. And so China is definitely not sinning in keeping the sanction.
You froze there, Jörg. We lost you a little.
Yeah.
Sorry, you froze a couple of seconds.
Yeah, must be something I said wrongly. So in a way, it is something where it's an awkward relationship. And Nick is totally right. It is possibly a massive blunder of having misjudged Putin. And I'm sure that when Putin was here in Beijing at the beginning of February, he certainly didn't tell Xi Jinping, by the way, I have 3 weeks from now a major show going. And now they are sort of caught in the act. And they can only do fence sitting. There will be no initiative from China of trying to defuse the situation. There will be no leverage that China has. China certainly cannot help the US. That's the last thing they can do is helping Biden. And so they do fence sitting, looking smart and trying to avoid all kinds of discussions. But like all of us, they're paying for that in the import on wheat and corn and whatnot, that they have to pay as much as we do globally.
That is very interesting. There's a lot of people coming in with questions. So I'll take a few of them, and they go from vaccine to human rights. One is on vaccine, and isn't it hard to believe that China keeps a zero COVID policy because of low vaccine efficiency? Other countries have relied on Chinese vaccines, are fully reopened. But China clearly has the capacity to administer boosters and carry over a successful vaccination campaign. If technical factors don't fully explain this policy, what is behind the decision, and when should this policy end? Well, you kind of answered when you thought it would end, but it's true that China in the vaccine policy or vaccine diplomacy in the beginning of COVID did export a lot of vaccine to other countries who have vaccinated a vast majority of their citizens with Sinovac vaccines and similar, and they seem to be better protected than the Chinese. Is this an issue that is being discussed in China, or how do you see that?
No, they're not better protected. It's just they like Singapore, for example, and other countries, they have a mix. They have Sinovac, they have Sinopharm, 2 shots, and then Singapore demands a 3rd shot has to be mRNA. So either Moderna or BioNTech, and that's exactly the right way to go. China basically had the vaccination right until November last year. And since Omicron, they don't have the right vaccination anymore. But again, they're stuck in this kind of, we export vaccine and we're doing fine. And the 3rd shot of Sinopharm is not bad, but Omicron, in particular BA.5, is a different animal. And so now we're heading into a phase with huge uncertainty looming over this country. And what's shocking is actually I'm sort of part of this background thing about BioNTech and Fosun and a new dimension, a new partner for BioNTech, and it goes nowhere. And it has to do with the fact that China, or the leadership believes, at least the party believes, that a foreign vaccine cannot be communicated to the people. First of all, the foreign vaccine has been bad-mouthed in the media for a long period of time. Side effects here, side effects there. But now there it is. BioNTech comes on the market now next month with a dedicated BA.4 and BA.5, and that's what China would need. Of course, they cannot sign it up. They can't even produce it in China. There's a factory in Shanghai that was supposed to produce mRNA from BioNTech. And BioNTech definitely pointed out that it takes 6 to 9 months to fix this factory. And do they have own mRNA? Yes, in planning. Will it be effective against Omicron? Nobody knows, possibly not. So in a way, it is really, the party is gambling with the health of its people by not doing enough on vaccination. And then there's the communication part. People here resent vaccination. 2 weeks ago, Beijing said on a Wednesday, you can only enter public places if you're vaccinated correctly. There was a shitstorm happening, and 24 hours later, they took it back, and they realized that it was a mistake. And my worry is that this kind of flip-flopping of the Beijing government will lead to the fact that other mayors take a cue and say, hey, I don't have any strong vaccination. I do better with COVID-0, and sort of just testing everyone to death. So in a way, we are in a deep hole, and they keep digging.
Yeah,
I think it's important to recognize that an additional factor is when China initially did its clinical trials on its own vaccines, they only tested people under age 60. They found they were reasonably effective, not as effective as the mRNA vaccines in the West, but their clinical trial was not well designed. So when they started rolling out their own vaccines, they said, oh, this vaccine is only available for people under 60. So people over 60 got the idea that they shouldn't take this vaccine, that it would be harmful. And that's a residual factor in the fact that older people are not very vaccinated. Younger people are more vaccinated. So the big mistake was long ago when they designed their clinical trials and only tested vaccines on people under 60. So they gave the impression when it was approved, the government said it's approved, but only if you're under 60. So the older generation was given the idea that the vaccines were unsafe. And I think that's been an uphill battle to try to erase that perception.
Yeah, because they are, of course, I mean, the older you are, the more vulnerable you are. That's a fact in this pandemic. So if you can force people to be locked in for months at home, there must be a way to administrate a vaccine campaign also for elderly people, you would think.
Well, you would think it's an authoritarian system. And I mean, I met Li Keqiang in May, had 2 hours with him, and I said, you know, you have these long lines every day. What a waste of resources. People waiting for tests. Why don't you just add another tent and look up the vaccination, and then bang, you know, if you're not vaccinated right, you get your vaccination and you move on. It's impossible for him. He believes it's the right thing. I personally believe he's not into zero tolerance. I cannot sense it with any of the state council ministers. They're not in favor of zero tolerance, but the party is. And Nick is totally right. They completely have brainwashed the people initially by projecting this as a danger. Unlike in Germany, the first person vaccinated in Germany 2 years ago, she was 100 years old.
Yeah, well, the same in most countries, and they gave interviews in TV and so on to inspire others. There are also lots of questions on China's role in regional trade, one person here wants you to share your thoughts on China's role in regional trade pacts, such as the RCEP. And now, of course, China has also applied to join the CPTPP, which is the former TPP that has resurged and now is in force since a year ago. So how do you see that, and what effect would that have on China's economy and recovery?
Oh, it's Nick, baby steps. I mean, the RCEP is virtually something which sounds great. On tariffs, it takes a while in order to get there. And if you compare the RCEP deal with the deals that you managed, Cecilia, between Europe and Vietnam, of Europe and Korea, Europe and Japan, I mean, these are very deep, substantial trade deals. We are very far away from RCEP on this one. So, yes, it is certainly an improvement. The beneficiaries are Japan and Korea because they never had a trade deal. All of a sudden, they're in the same bed. But it's nothing that's going to swing the needle substantially, nor is the other one. Abbreviation is not my strength.
You know, if you're in the trade business, you're drowned in acronyms. But right. The comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Trade, whatever CPTPP stands for, the one that the US left. And China has applied to join, so has Taiwan and UK, actually. Would this mean, and would this be very beneficial for the China? And is it any realism that they can make the reforms needed to join? Then, of course, others have to accept, but that's another story. What's your view, Nick?
Well, I think we have to wait and see. The negotiation has barely started. And the thing is, you know, what kind of transition periods might China be allowed? They obviously can't possibly meet the high standards on day one. And so what ins will be allowed? And so I would expect that over a period of time, it could have a substantial effect. But I think in the short run, particularly if they get a lot of exemptions and phase-ins, that it will not have a big effect.
There's another question for you, Nick, here. What can we expect in terms of further US action against China, especially if the Democrats lose the congressional majority in November? Do you want to speculate about that?
Well, I'm not sure it makes much difference how the elections our elections turn out, because there's a pretty united front among Democrats and Republicans that we need to be very tough on China, particularly economically and technologically. So I think we're moving stronger in that direction. That's what's happened under Biden. More sanctions, more companies being put on the entity list, more tightening up of export restrictions, possibly now significant tightening up of examination of outbound investment into China. So I don't think the elections are going to change the direction. I think the direction we're firmly headed in is tighter restrictions, more recognition of the competition. And I don't see China making any compromises or changes in its trade policy or its investment policy, some of which George has referred to. And if they're not willing to move on better market access in certain areas and so forth, I don't think there's going to be a change in US policy. We could do something like reduce some of the tariffs as part of an anti-inflation policy. But even that is far from assured, as we've seen in the debate over the recent months about whether or not to do anything on that front.
In the Trade and Tech Council that has been created between the EU and the US last September, and then there was a meeting on a high-level ministerial in May this year, where, of course, a lot of the discussion was around Ukraine sanctions and follow-up and monitoring of sanctions. But in the whole concept of the Trade and Tech Council, which has 10 different working groups on supply chains, on semiconductors, on artificial intelligence, etc., there is a notion that the EU and the US should cooperate to address Chinese technology competition, and that one should do things together. Is this a forum that you think can be used to formulate joint Chinese policy, or is it more political to reinforce what's already been done? Hard to tell.
It's clearly from Nick.
No, I think I'm agnostic. There's not much transparency on what all these 10 working groups are doing, and if they come up with recommended policies, are they going to be adopted by all the parties? So maybe there's some underlying benefit of this, but it's hard to see what its concrete effect will be, particularly in the short run.
There are lots of questions also on Taiwan that keep coming in, but I think you both addressed them and said that is not an imminent threat. People ask whether President Xi Jinping would invade Taiwan as a way to deter attention from the COVID policy and economic problems and unemployment. But you don't think that is something that is an immediate threat? Because this is, of course, something that experts, foreign policy experts, and military experts are discussing widely in Europe and the US as well, all the time.
Oh, by talking to decision makers here, I would say they're all very clairvoyant and realistic about it. If China blockades, the mainland blockades Taiwan already, it would be miserable. And the semiconductor shortages globally that we experienced over the last 2 years would be just a magnifold, much, much bigger. And China would be virtually at the receiving end of a massive problem there. A war would, of course, be totally different. And China is clearly looking at how Soviet Union, my God, Russia is doing by invading Ukraine, and clearly seeing the problems there. China hasn't fought any war since 1979. Their troops are definitely ill coordinated. They might have great equipment, but the fact that China could actually consider to invade Taiwan is very far-fetched. So I guess give it a couple of more years, but of course, there are two areas where we are concerned about. First of all, will Taiwan turn more and more nationalistic themselves, turning away, given also of Hong Kong, having a nearly 100% kind of consensus of we surely don't want mainland, and do they get the kind of support from outside that which actually will sort of breach the kind of unthinkable barrier. And also China, if China actually, or the leadership, whatever, in 5 years or so, realize that they have a lot of problems, sort of use it as whack the dog, a kind of situation that you might want to invade Taiwan in order to paper over all the cracks in the wall that you have in your own economy and society over there. Again, as some friend of mine here said, much risk, much win. And so I don't see it. I see that the system indeed has people preparing for war. This is the minority. I don't see any imminent danger as we speak, but it also partly depends on us how we deal with this. Europe has found an appetite in poking into the eye of the dragon when it comes to Taiwan. Again, Lithuania was ill-advised of actually accepting this Taiwan office. They could have called it Taipei. We have to see how that develops. Of course, the Chinese actions on Lithuania are totally unacceptable. It's in a deep interference in the domestic internal market of the European Union. But again, there you are, that you have a situation like this. So no immediate danger that I can see. But of course, we all have to be dealing with this responsibly. And this kind of status quo that we enjoyed so far, certainly I would say serves us best.
Do you agree with this, Nick? That would be the final words.
I agree completely, and I would underscore particularly not poking the eye of the dragon. Some very tough China hawks in the United States are all set on beefing up our relations with Taiwan, selling them more military equipment, sending higher level delegations to visit Taiwan. All of those things risk upsetting the status quo. And as George said, we've all benefited from the status quo. I think our policy objective should be to continue the status quo that has existed for decades. It has benefited Taiwan, it has benefited the United States, and all the talk about, you know, an invasion is coming, we better help Taiwan strengthen their defenses and so forth and so on, I think is not the right way to go.
Well, thank you so much. I know it's getting late in Beijing and we are running out of time as well. There's so much to discuss. We could have spent many hours, but thank you for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, giving us a more nuanced picture of the situation. And at least I leave with much more knowledge on this. So thank you for Nick. Thank you, Jörg. Thank you to all of you who have been watching. You can also watch it on the Peterson Institute website afterwards if you want to see it again. And wishing you a good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you, Nick. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Take care. Bye. Stay safe.